We are now going to have a conversation, so the format is going to change a little bit. We're going to have a conversation about the B word, Brexit. The discussion is going to focus on, the potential implications of Brexit and what are the challenges and the opportunities that can be harnessed from what we are seeing happening across the road from where we are, if you know what I mean. Leading the conversation will be Barry Tomalin from 7D News and also James Watt from the Ambassador Partnership. They will be in conversation, and please note that they will also allow questions and answers at the end of their conversation. May I also, ladies and gentlemen, let you know that there is a social hashtag, which is hashtag CBTE19, and there's going to be a prize for a person who shares the most pictures, the most summary of the conversations that we're having. And I've negotiated this prize without even telling the people that are going to give the prize, but Craig says it's okay. You're going to get 2 VIP tickets to an Arsenal game in the United Kingdom. So at the end of the day, we're going to announce the winner at the champagne reception and networking session. So please tweet, please go on Instagram, please go on Facebook and say hashtag CBTE19. And over to the impact of Brexit discussion. Thank you.
Before we begin, may I just check the microphones here are working, yeah? Yes, they are. Good. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Barry Tomalin, and I'm from 7D News, and I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, James Watt. James is a partner in the Ambassador Partnership, one of the sponsors of this conference, and he is also himself a diplomat, former ambassador, and a columnist. He writes both for the Ambassador Partnership and also for my organization, 7D News. So welcome, James. Interesting that Pumela started with a welcome in Mandarin. Douglas Dong Dao gave us a saying in Mandarin. I think in English, I at least can continue with the tradition and say, one of the great Chinese sayings which we all use is, may you live in interesting times. So I'm interested in your first column that you wrote for us, James. You mentioned very early in your career, somebody gave you the advice, never be surprised by the turn of events. So I think my first question has to be, given the last couple of weeks, are you surprised?
Ultimately not surprised. I think all of us who were looking objectively and, let's say, rationally at the scenario 3 years ago could see that this kind of great difficulty, this great impasse was going to emerge from what the government set out to do. I am surprised, though, perhaps, by the time it's taken for the penny to drop, for people to realize just how impossible the various conflicting promises have been. And the way it's played out has been a surprise because we didn't expect to get to this point where it really is down to Parliament to try and put a brake on certain things and to try to find a new way forward. And that hasn't been resolved, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, I think that leads us in, following the vote on the withdrawal motion and also the vote of confidence in the Prime Minister and the government. What are the options for us in the 6 weeks or so that are left?
Well, I think the vote of confidence in Mrs. May's government, following straight on the massive defeat the previous day on the withdrawal bill, shows that nobody wants a general election at this point. It'll take too long. It wouldn't resolve anything. As you say, time is very short. So a general election right now is ruled out. That would normally be, in British politics, that would be the way you would resolve a major difference. But as I'm sure you all know, both the major parties are split down the middle about whether they want to remain or whether they want to leave the European Union. And so we wouldn't get a resolution that way. However, I think behind all these issues, it's really important to say that parliamentary sovereignty is perhaps the biggest thing at stake here, the actual operation of Britain's political system. It has been challenged, we all know, by the fact a referendum was held, a referendum which was so close, it came out on one side, but so close it was never really going to do more than divide the country further. So it was, in the view of many of us, a very foolish step to take. It's also dangerous because you get a direct clash between the representative form of democracy through Parliament that we've relied on for a long time now, well over a century, some people would say longer, and the direct populist type of vote through a referendum. That damage has been done. One of the many challenges we're facing at the moment is how to undo that damage without doing more harm to the political fabric of the country, which, as you know, has been very divided and passions have been aroused. The way forward, I think, has got to take account of so many elements. One of them is the very big element: how do we protect our way of political life? A way which is designed to achieve, if not consensus, at least acceptance of more or less compromise or centre ground positions. So I personally am very attracted by the idea of another referendum to undo the effects or to confirm the effects of the first referendum as a way out of this impasse. At the same time, I'm increasingly aware that that itself wouldn't provide a long-term solution. It would probably cause more divisions. It would do more harm to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So although I'm sympathetic to that, and if it came out of the wash as that's the way forward, then of course we'll treat it positively. But I'm quite hesitant about it. The way forward has to be, first of all, to be realistic about red lines. I think all of us know that Mrs. May started, when she became Prime Minister, by drawing some very firm and big red lines, which were not actually dictated by the actual outcome of the referendum. She chose to take a very hard line, and she chose to then force the timetable by issuing the letter, as you know, the letter of notification to the European Union that we were going to withdraw from it under the terms of Article 50. And she did that, setting the clock ticking, which, was, as you know, now runs out on the 29th of March. In the process, she made her negotiating hand with the rest of the European countries, incredibly difficult to play. I mean, impossible. Really, she has tied herself in knots. So when she did that, none of us, I think, was surprised to see that she hasn't been able to achieve what she set out to achieve. And unfortunately, she seems to be one of the few people left who don't realize that there's a need to change course and find a compromise way forward, because I think everybody has got to compromise. As you know from recent statements, even since her massive defeat on Tuesday, she's still sticking doggedly to her way of doing things, her red lines, and all sorts of maximum desiderata, which are making the whole thing impossible.
Okay. One of the things, staying with the politics just for a minute, one of the things which is very important in her support system is the support of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, in Northern Ireland, which poses a particular issue because you have the island of Ireland, which has the south, which is a member of the EU, and the north, which is a member of the UK. And there is this proposal to have a backstop agreement to ease, to ease the border. First of all, could you explain what is the backstop and why is it causing such a problem in the negotiations?
The backstop is essentially a guarantee that there will not be a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which, as you know, is part of the United Kingdom. And that, I think, is important. Nobody, when they started the Brexit process or any other process, ever intended to create problems between the two parts of Ireland. Those problems were solved by the Belfast Agreement of 1998, which was negotiated with great difficulty and great skill and courage after years, 30, 40 years of armed conflict in Northern Ireland, which had devastated the province and which nobody wants to see come back. I think it's interesting that the European Union itself its roots came from a determination after the end of the Second World War never to allow the terrible international conflict that broke out between European powers ever to happen again. And people were thinking in terms of Germany and its allies, and France and Britain and their allies. And that it has served its purpose. It is ultimately a peacemaking project and a peace guaranteeing project. And in 1998, the fact that both Britain and the Republic of Ireland were members of the European Union actually helped, and indeed probably underpinned very solidly, the peace agreement that was reached between the warring parties in Northern Ireland and ultimately guaranteed by the governments in London and Dublin. So the European Union isn't just a convenient trade mechanism or mechanism for people to cross the notional border, the invisible border between the two parts of Ireland. It is actually a guarantee of peace. And I think people who live in Ireland and people who've been involved in the talks and have memories of the conflict take that very seriously. And I think it's a matter of great distress that there are leaders, I'm sorry to say mostly in the Tory party as far as I can see, who simply don't seem to care about that aspect, who have not taken Ireland's concerns seriously, nor Scotland's, which voted strongly to remain, nor Wales, which voted to leave, but now we're told would rather remain. It has just drawn a very hard line between English nationalism or an English perspective on the future of England and the interests of the others. So the backstop is actually, it was a device designed to state as a principle that there will never be a visible border between the two parts of Ireland. How you implement that, this was signed over a year ago by the British government with the European Union side. And how you actually achieve that, at the time there was lots of kind of fictional fantasy talk of technical solutions. You could somehow control all these movements without having a hard or visible border. That is not working. But there's now talk that if Britain remained in the customs union with the European Union while leaving the union, somehow that would ease the problem, but it would a little bit. But actually, it's the single market that counts. Britain needs to remain in the single market if there really is to be a frictionless exchange over the border between the two parts of Ireland. And the DUP are obviously very strongly committed to the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and they don't want to see any development which begins to push the province into, as it were, the arms of Dublin. Not that Dublin is trying to intrigue in that way, but that's the way history will move if there is going to be this division between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So that makes it an extremely sensitive issue for them, for the DUP, which, as you know, sustains the minority government of Mrs. May. And it's a sensitive issue for a lot of Tories, a lot of Conservative Party leavers who, I say, don't care enormously about Ireland, but actually they do care about the idea of not letting the union somehow split apart in some way.
So thank you for that. Now let's then move across to the trade area. If we arrived, which is still on the table, a no-deal solution, which is not really a solution, but a no-deal situation, Britain will then be able to negotiate its own trade agreements with countries around the world. And of course, the reason we're here today is China. How do you see the development of trade with China if there is a no deal and Britain is able to go its own way?
First of all, there's this lovely idea that if Britain can free itself from the shackles of Brussels, it can go and negotiate wonderful, more advantageous trade deals with the rest of the world, including China. Britain actually has a very successful free trade agreement with China and a separate one with Hong Kong, as it happens. Mm-hmm. That's working very well. The European Union, meanwhile, is negotiating a free trade agreement with China, which will probably be bigger and better. If Britain leaves the European Union, we won't be part of that deal, or we won't have a say in it, certainly. We don't need to actually negotiate a new free trade agreement with China, fortunately, but we would with practically the whole of the rest of the world. That would take decades, and we would be negotiating from a position of extraordinary weakness. It would rule out, if we were to achieve that, having the freedom to negotiate these deals, which is somehow an ideological commitment of a lot of the sort of Leave leaders in the Conservative Party, we would actually do ourselves serious damage, because we would have had to leave completely the customs union and the single market of the European Union, and they are our major market, and they are the source of most of the regulation, practically all the regulation, which governs our product specifications, our trade, and we would have to start with that all over again. It would be highly disruptive, and it's perhaps the biggest fantasy, and it's the first of the red lines that Mrs. May should delete.
Delete, right. And what's interesting about this, when it gets into more detail, with all the countries, even if Britain decides to go for this strange place called the Anglosphere, English-speaking countries, and with China, the major economies, etc., we have issues of tariffs, which instead of having a single tariff agreement, we now have multiple tariff agreements. We have issues, and these are very big ones even now, with standards and regulations, and something which Douglas Dongdao was talking a little bit about in relation to his discussion on Shanghai. And then, of course, we have the issues of trade agreements, as you said, which will take ages. How do we handle the issues of tariffs, differing tariffs around the world? How do we handle, for me, which is an even bigger problem, this difference of standards and regulations, and above all, I guess, supply chain management?
Absolutely. I think supply chain management would be the most acute problem. In effect, Britain would remain with the existing standards we have, which are European Union standards, and we would presumably want to keep developing them on exactly the same lines as the European Union in order to ensure compatibility of supply chains, but also ultimately product markets and so on. So I think that there's really there's no way in which Britain can set itself up as kind of low-cost, low-tax Singapore on Thames, which is one of the lovely ideas that have come out of this. I do think, though, I've sounded a bit negative about all this, but I do think there's something emotional here, which is that China is a very entrepreneurial economy, as we know, and Britain, the British Brexiters, would like Britain to show itself to be more entrepreneurial and more, in their view, buccaneering, in the sense of breaking the rules, getting rid of the rules that don't fit, and finding a new way of doing things. And I like that positive sense. I like that ambition. Unfortunately, if you look, you immediately see that in practice it won't work. It would cause considerable economic harm to the country. But I don't want to lose the spirit of it. And I've noticed that friends here in London who are not from Europe, from other countries, including China, really are quite warm about the idea of Britain distinguishing itself from the rest of Europe and being different and being more approachable than this great block of rather grey, bureaucratic-looking European Union rules and regulations, and somehow being more engaged with. And I think, as Douglas was saying, there's quite a lot of warmth, actually, particularly between the two global cities of London and Shanghai. I mean, there are similarities.
So there are links.
And I feel that there is that goodwill, that good feeling, and I don't want to lose that. But I think we need to remain with our feet on the ground to the extent that there are real-world consequences for breaking the very important set of rules represented by the single market and the customs union.
And I absolutely see this, because if you look at the world today, the whole world is now moving into trade, not trade blocs, but trade associations, ASEAN, NAFTA, etc., etc., etc. And at this precise moment in time, Britain decides to play the lone wolf.
Yes. I mean, it's rather splendid. It's kind of rather characteristically British and defiant, but it's not, again, we have to be realistic. There's this lovely idea that Britain could join the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
Yes.
Which the US has decided not to. And that, in a way, does appeal, because it's a bold move. It really restores Britain's position and sense of itself as a global player, a global economic player, politically a little bit, but more a global economic player. We are a country open to China, we're open to Asia generally in the world, and we'd like to do more of that. But I don't see why we need to leave the European Union in order to take advantage of those opportunities. Britain has been less of an investor in China than Germany or France. They're members of the European Union. They don't feel any need to to leave in order to carry on benefiting from Asian trade. So I would like us to take that phrase from Boris Johnson, have our cake and eat it. I'd like us to have the European Union cake, and also to play the card we haven't properly played, which is a far more engaged and bold approach to investing and cooperating with Asian investors, entrepreneurs, inventors, thinkers, of which we have quite a bit here in London already, and I just think we're not valuing that enough.
Not using it enough.
Yeah.
No, I take your point. And I was very interested when you said that, in fact, in the European Union, Germany is the major exporter to China and also the leading importer of Chinese goods. So, yes, you're right, that relationship can exist while being part of the Union. Okay, I think one more question before we just take the question of things. Deborah Benetti, who is the chair of the Foreign Press Association, set up a meeting with William Hill, the well-known bookmakers, to examine Brexit possibilities. She did warn in her piece in 7D News that if you did this, bookmakers quite often lose out. However, if you were going to place a bet on Theresa May's statement in 3 days' time and what she's going to do on the 21st of January, what do you think it would be? What's the outcome?
I'm afraid my very short-term bet is that she is still not going to show any sign of understanding that her red lines are incompatible with reality, incompatible with the deep interests of this country, and that she's got to show more political skill, more leadership and more vision to unite the country, but also bring together enough elements in Parliament to find majority vote in Parliament for the next step, whatever it is. We haven't got time to go through all that without, I believe, either extending the period of the withdrawal notification or indeed abrogating it completely. It would do us no harm at all to simply abrogate the notification under Article 50 to the European Union, simply say, where we're drawing that, we would carry on as before. And this could be done with an explicit statement to the British people that this is absolutely without prejudice to Britain's future relationship with Europe. It's just that we need to take a deep breath, we need to step back, we need to give ourselves as a country time to develop our position and our negotiating plan before, if necessary, notifying again and giving ourselves another 2 years. But I think the country is so divided and damaged politically that we, as a country, need to give ourselves that pause without closing off any options. And this is a view not just that I've taken, but the Ambassador Partnership, which I'm part of. We've concluded that this is the right way forward, preferably an abrogation, but if not, a proper extension for all the difficulties involved. And I think as part of that, there has to be a general election, which is the normal way in Britain of resolving a major political difference, and that could happen sometime in the next 2 years. We would have to see. I think a general election is preferable to another referendum, because I think it would begin to restore the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and government, rather than carry on with this rather damaging path of trying to solve complex problems through very simple referenda.
Okay, thank you. So basically, extend it, abrogate Article 50 for the time being at least,
yes.
General election to see what the country really wants.
And a big period of national debate, which has got to be led by consensus-minded politicians from all sides. And there are plenty of them. But unfortunately, the one in Parliament, in number 10 at the moment, isn't a consensus-minded politician.
Okay, well, we won't go any further than that. James, thank you very much indeed. That was very, very clear and very, very helpful. We have time for a couple of questions from people who'd like to ask them. We have a couple of mics wandering around the place. So if you'd like to ask a question, do just raise your hand. There's one over here. And wait for a microphone to come, sir. And if you just say who you are and the organisation you represent, and James will be yours. Have we got a microphone, please? It is heading towards you in a stately manner, I think, down here in the front. Thanks a lot. Great.
Thank you. My name's George Doughty. I think what I'm about to say is a personal view rather than the view of the company that I work for. So I think I'll park on that invitation. I just want to make a couple of observations and a question or two within it. I hear and understand your concerns about red lines as written by the British government. But I also feel that Brussels have had their red lines, and they have shown intransigence as well. And I think to get any successful negotiation, you need both sides to make the dance. And I don't see, and I'd be very interested to hear if you see any sign from Brussels that there's any flexibility on their side. Because if there isn't, an extra 2 years, an extra 3 years, an extra 5 years is totally immaterial. There is no point. That's my first point. The second one is, I can recall very similar debates happening before the decision was made for this country not to join the euro. I think Gordon Brown was extremely brave to make that decision. And I think with hindsight, that was, as far as this country is concerned, definitely the right decision. And I think that should have been a clear indicator to Brussels that the federal project that they had, where we're going to have a common Minister of Finance, a common tax system, a common, federal system, was really not something that the British people was going to entertain, let alone support. I'm interested in your idea of the second referendum, and I'm not the first person to ask this question, but I would really struggle to see what would be on the paper. Is it going to be May's version, or we stay in? And I don't think there's anybody in the country that supports May's version, whether on whatever side of the fence you're in. Would it be a revisit of complete leave, or ignore, or not ignore, but repeal the first decision? I'm not entirely convinced that the British people wouldn't reconfirm their original decision. I think it's a very brave person who would go for that. Similarly, if you revisit that referendum, then you're opening the door for the Scottish referendum to be revisited, and that is a can of worms I think you would agree with. So I think those are my general comments. I'm trying to be constructive, but I just think that it takes two people to tango, and I'm not convinced that Brussels is interested in tangoing, because I think they're very nervous that if they're seen to show any flexibility with us, then problems elsewhere will really undermine the European project.
Thank you, sir. James.
Thank you. I very much agree with the thrust of your comments and questions. On the flexibility of Brussels, of course, Brussels is the 27 member states plus the Commission. And so there's a degree of rigidity there in the sense there needs to be unanimity on their side. You've got to negotiate that through a huge number of governments, some of which have very different positions. And I agree, Brussels has been pretty unyielding. They set out their position at the beginning, and they have not felt much need to make concessions. And I think the reasons for that are, as you said, because they don't want to set a precedent whereby the European Union can begin to fall to pieces with states deciding to pick and choose which bits they want. And as you know, since the referendum in Britain, there have been developments like the elections in Italy, which have seen populist government come to power, which is pretty hostile to the European Union. So I think Brussels' concerns are genuine. I don't think they're just being grumpy and difficult. I think they're genuine. I think you've got some very strong players like Emmanuel Macron in France who will stick to that line very strongly. He doesn't want any concessions to Britain on this. So it's a genuine problem. I think, I agree with you, Gordon Brown was absolutely right to keep us out of the euro. I think Britain was absolutely right to have negotiated over all these years we've been in the Union and before it, very special arrangements, concessions and so on. Before we had the referendum 2.5 years ago, we all could see that Europe was developing in a way in which there's going to be a more solid and dynamic core wanting to do more Euro things together and a periphery that wanted to do less, and Britain was definitely in the second category. I would have preferred us to stay in the Union and negotiate that future structure, including a looser arrangement between Britain and the European Union, in an orderly and beneficial way, with us getting the best deal we could from within. And I think quite a few other states would have taken a similar position to us. I just think the way we've gone about the referendum itself and then the application of red lines after the referendum has just made that very difficult. I think Mrs. May has gained sympathy in Brussels and among European leaders. I say Brussels is shorthand for European leadership generally, for the very difficult position she's in. At the same time, I don't believe she was particularly tactful or helpful in the way she was dealing with them, certainly in the course of the 2 years of negotiations. Somebody a little bit more sensitive and perhaps more skillful would have found a way forward. So there's sympathy for her, but at the same time there's a legacy of mistrust, which that needs to be healed and overcome for Britain and the rest of the Europeans to negotiate successfully together.
Thanks, James. That's great.
Sorry.
We've got time for just one more question before we finish. Yes, sir. If you could get a microphone across to the gentleman next to you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robin Clifford from CLA Consulting. I'd just like to actually pick up on the last comment and perhaps explore it from the other direction. Brexit is not just our problem. The cause of Brexit is not just our problem. It's a European problem, and the circumstances under which Brexit actually happened was pretty much a problem of Europe's own making, both in the long-term establishment of the conditions under which it originally happened, and the shorter-term conditions under which they sent Cameron back with a flea in his ear when he went around to try and sort it out. We're all heading towards the precipice, and nobody thinks that any of it is a good idea, and there doesn't seem to be any positive outcome for anybody. Given the option that was discussed earlier of perhaps rescinding Article 50, stopping the headlong rush to the cliff edge, and then taking stock on both sides of the channel, election here, new leader, new government, someone slightly less intransigent than we have at the moment. There are elections coming up in numerous European countries. There are elections coming up in the Parliament, and I believe in the Commission and the Council as well, over the course of the next year. There will be a complete change of personalities. And it might just be the option for everyone to take stock, sit back, whether it's Macron or whoever else it might be, and think, oh, we very, very nearly broke the entire China set here. Let's, forgive me, that wasn't quite meant in the terms under this, so I say the glassware cabinet, perhaps. There is now an option, perhaps, for everyone to think how best to get this back on the rails. Is that something that might even be feasible, if not practical?
Thank you. James, briefly, please.
I very much agree with the line you've just set out, yes. And I wish it were feasible. I think there's a lot of good people and goodwill in our Parliament and across the Channel, but they need to emerge and their voice needs to be able to lead policy more clearly than it is now.
So we sort of know where we are. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in for the session this morning. We're going to end it here. I'll hand you back to Pumela. And James, thank you very much indeed.